Chapter 10 looks at global stratification. So, not only do we have unequal distribution of wealth, power, and prestige here within our own country, but we also have it across the globe. So, here you can see this chart tells us what percentage of children die before age 5 based on the country they live in. And you can see a stark difference here between like Sierra Leone and Sweden. So global stratification refers to patterns of social inequality in the world as a whole. So the richest 20% of the US population earns about 50% of the national income, and the richest 20% of the global population earns about 80% of the world's income. The poorest fifth of the world's people struggle to survive on 1% of global income. Now let's take a minute looking at terminology. You guys might be familiar with the concept of like a third world nation. So old terminology talks about first world, second world, and third world countries. The first world are rich, capitalist, highly industrialized countries like the United States. The second world is less industrialized socialist countries, and the third world is non-industrialized poor countries. Now some problems with this is post-Cold War, the second world kind of doesn't really exist anymore. Okay, that's mostly Russia or the USSR. And the third world is too economically diverse for that to be a meaningful term. So instead we talk about high income, middle income, and low income nations. So high income nations obviously are those with the highest overall standards of living. Middle income nations have a standard of living that's about average for the world as a whole. And low income nations have a low standard of living in which most people are poor. Now the advantages to this typology is that it focuses on economic development as opposed to the political structure and provides a better picture of the relative economic development of various countries. So let's take a minute to talk about these. So high-income countries are the first to develop during the Industrial Revolution 2 centuries ago. It covers about 65% of Earth's land. It's about 3.6 billion people, about 2/3 of the world's income, and they tend to control the financial markets, which means control of other countries. And so production in these countries is capital intensive. This includes the US, Canada, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Western Europe, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, China, New Zealand, countries like that. Now, middle-income countries, which are countries like Colombia, Armenia, Lebanon, Cambodia, Kenya, Pakistan, about half of the population lives in or near cities and have industrial jobs, and then the other half lives in rural areas. This covers about 20% of the Earth's land, about 3.2 billion people, and is very densely populated, and they have introduced more free market systems. Now, low-income countries, like most of the countries in Africa, are poor agrarian societies with some industry. It's about 15% of the Earth's land and just under 1 billion people. These are also densely populated, but most live in villages and farms, and lives are really shaped by hunger, disease, and unsafe housing. And so here you can sort of see this breakdown globally. So when we think about poverty in poor countries is obviously much more severe than poverty in rich countries. As we mentioned in the previous chapter, we do have poverty here in the United States, and many people suffer here in the United States, but relative to other countries, it's not quite as bad. That sounds terrible. So we've got relative poverty and absolute poverty, which we also talked about before. So absolute poverty is like extreme poverty. The kind of poverty that is life-threatening, right? You don't know where your next meal is coming from. You don't have proper nutrition. And relative poverty are some people lacking resources that are taken for granted by others. So every 10 minutes, about 60 people sick and weakened from hunger die. It's about 15,000 people a day across the globe. 800 million people in the world, about 10%, suffer from chronic hunger. Now, good news, the extent of global hunger has decreased by about half since 1990, but world hunger remains one of the most serious responsibilities. And considering the amount of wealth that does exist in the world, really no excuse for it to exist. And here we can see national poverty rates globally. Now, the onset of the pandemic resulted in an increase in extreme poverty for the first time in the century. So COVID-19 really resulted in a lot of hardships, and it pushed extreme poverty up by about 100 million people. People literally lost jobs like immediately as businesses closed down. High-income regions experienced the least disruption from this and the least harm, and poor countries were hit the hardest. Now, children become poor for various reasons. Their parents have passed away, there's family conflict, maybe they live somewhere where there was a natural disaster, or they live somewhere where there's war. Could be that they're being rejected based on their identity. And they miss out on schooling then and are likely to fall victim to physical disease, mental health issues, drug abuse, and violence. And many girls also become pregnant. In terms of poverty in women, women's work is undervalued, underpaid, overlooked. Again, we saw this with the pandemic. Once people were home and their kids weren't in school anymore, people kind of realized, oh, we kind of rely on school to be like daycare for our kids, right? It's childcare for our children. What happens when you have to work or you have to work from home and now your kids are home all day? And we also don't really place any value on the labor that parents who remain at home rearing children and don't work in the workforce contribute. Most sweatshop workers, right, jobs that are unsafe and underpaid are women, and tradition keeps women out of many different jobs in low-income nations. Most women in poor countries receive little to no reproductive health care, and the world's poorest women typically give birth without help from any trained healthcare personnel. When we think about slavery, obviously strongly tied to inequality and poverty, this exists in different forms. Most of us probably think of this as sort of what we think of here in our country and our country's history, in the history of, kidnapping and stealing people in Africa and bringing them here. So there's descent-based slavery, which is one person owns another, and then, as that happened here in the U.S., you owned whatever babies those slaves had because you owned them. There's forced labor imposed by the state. The government imposes forced labor on people convicted of crimes. There's child slavery, where children are sent out by their families to do whatever they can to survive. There's debt bondage, where employers pay wages that are less than what workers are charged for company-provided food and housing. There's servile forms of marriage, where women are married against their will or forced into prostitution. And then, of course, human trafficking. You probably think of human trafficking in terms of like when we sex traffic somebody, but human trafficking can also happen for purposes of labor. So human trafficking is the moving of men, women, and children from one place to another for the purpose of performing forced labor. So what kind of things play a role in shaping global poverty? Well, technology plays a role. About a quarter of the people in low-income countries use human and animal power to farm land. Population growth for poor countries in Africa doubled every 25 years. And then poor societies are usually traditional and resistant of change, and even change that promises a richer material life. So some other reasons here would be social stratification. Low-income societies distribute wealth very unevenly. There's a lot of gender inequality, so raising the living standards depends on improving the social standing of women. And then, what are the relationships between nations and cultures globally? So historically, wealth flowed from poor societies to rich societies through colonialism. And some nations enrich themselves through political and economic control of other nations. Now, exploitation continues today through neo-colonialism, right? So just neo meaning like a new form of colonialism. This is a form of global power relationships that involves not direct political control, but economic exploitation through multinational corporations. Okay, a multinational corporation is like a big company, a big business that does business in multiple countries. So, what are some theories that explain this? Well, modernization theory says economic and social development can be explained or can be used to explain global inequality in terms of technological and cultural differences. So, a long time ago, hundreds of years ago, the whole world was poor, okay? As people begin to explore and trade, and we have the Industrial Revolution, Western Europe and North America really become transformed and become super duper powerful. Absolute poverty declines, and the standard of living jumps in some areas of the world. And culture plays a huge role in this, right? So, modernization theory identifies tradition as the greatest barrier to economic development, right? People are sort of like, this is the way we've always done it, this is the way we do it. So, Weber said the Protestant Reformation really reshaped traditional Christian beliefs. Wealth became a sign of personal virtue, right? So, perhaps you've heard of the, excuse me, perhaps you've, okay, perhaps you've heard of Protestant work ethic, right? This is the idea that Protestants believe that if they work hard, God will reward them. And so having things and having wealth would be a sign that you're a hard worker and you have personal virtue. Now, Rostow says modernization comes in some stages here. The traditional stage is where we're honoring the past, and it's difficult to imagine life could be any different or even should be any different. During the takeoff stage, we see the use of people's talents. Then there's a drive to technological maturity, and then high mass consumption. Mass production stimulates mass consumption. So, what role do rich nations play in modernization theory? Well, controlling population is one. So, the rich countries play a role in promoting birth control and exporting birth control technology to other nations. Increasing the food production, so through the use of hybrid seeds, modern irrigation, chemical fertilizers, technology that we use in food production and farming, we can increase food production. We also can increase and introduce industrial technology. So as we develop machinery and information that helps facilitate the economy, that can get exported to other countries too. And then, of course, we often provide foreign aid. So what do we think about this theory? Well, modernization has not occurred in many poor countries. It doesn't really recognize or address how rich nations benefit from the status quo of poor nations. And it doesn't really recognize that international relations affect all relations. So our relationship with one country affects other countries. This ethnocentric approach holds up the richest nations as the standard, right? It sort of implies that what wealthy nations are doing is what's right. And again, just like in terms of individual or within country social stratification, it blames poverty on the poor. Now, dependency theory is a model of development that explains global inequality in terms of the exploitation of poor nations by rich ones. So basically, people living in poor countries were better off in the past than they are now, and the economic position of the rich and the poor are linked. So Europeans colonized so much of the globe, right? And a lot of that through slavery. And international slave trade is the most brutal form of human exploitation. I mean, when you really think about it, the idea that people just went to countries in Africa, kidnapped people, chained them up, put them on a boat, moved them across the ocean, and then we're like, somebody now owns you and you now must work for free. And any children you have, those people will own as well. Is insane. Just because countries have become politically liberated doesn't mean they become economically liberated. And so this colonialism is at the heart of modern capitalistic economy. And so here you can see Africa and the various different colonial powers. And you can see very little was not colonized, right? So basically, Ethiopia. That's it. Now, Wallerstein talks about a capitalist world economy and basically says that the global economy today is rooted in that colonialism that happened 500 years ago. So rich nations form the core of the world economy, and they are enriched by raw materials from around the world, right? So why does the US stick its nose in the business of other countries? Well, we often frame it in terms of like providing freedom for their people, right? And spreading democracy. But a lot of times it's because those countries have something we want. Low-income countries are the periphery. They provide inexpensive labor and a market for industrial products. And then we have a semi-periphery. Middle-income countries form that semi-periphery, and they have a closer tie to the core. Now, dependency, I think these slides are out of order. Okay. So this dependency theory looks at three factors. One, poorer nations produce only a few crops for export to rich countries. Poor countries sell raw materials to rich countries, and then we put that into some other product, and then we sell it back to you at a super high price. And poor countries owe rich countries a lot of money, much of which is owed to China. So all these theories are applying or assigning different roles to rich countries. Modernization theory says rich countries produce wealth, and dependency theory says it's more about how countries distribute wealth. So thinking about dependency theory, it wrongly treats wealth as a zero-sum game and blames rich nations for global poverty. It wrongly presents a simplistic analysis by citing capitalism as like the only factor. It also claims, sometimes inaccurately, that global trade always benefits rich countries. So the greatest concern with global stratification is, of course, economic inequality. There's a lot of concentration of wealth. A lot of wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few nations and a few select companies, groups, people in those nations. And you pair that with just absolute poverty. And that may be the biggest problem that we face as humans. Now, living standards are rising in absolute terms. And recent trends suggest that we need to look critically at both of these theories, both modernization and dependency theories. Now, it's sort of funny that your book is going to sum up the politics of global stratification in like one slide, since, again, you could get a whole degree in this. Okay, modernization is a somewhat conservative approach. Modern societies have borne of social change, driven by adopting more complex technology and increasing individual liberty. Okay, so in a modernization theory, the focus is on production. Dependence theory focuses on distribution, basically that this free market system is the cause of poverty. Now, looking at this from the right, from a conservative viewpoint, the main reason for inequality is human difference. Poor people are poor and other people have less power because they're just not good enough. And from the left, the main reason is the political and economic system.